Thank you. Good evening. Can you hear me okay? Good evening. It's really a great honor to be asked to deliver this Richard Gregory lecture. Thank you, Judith. Thank you, Dave, for inviting me. So I'm going to just talk at a somewhat convoluted way about the way in which I've got here. The title is really about the idea that having come entirely from a fiction-based background, I actually believe that fiction is the most powerful tool we have to create reality. So I'll kind of get into that. But first of all, just to recap a little bit of what Dave was saying. Dave accused me of not really having fallen forward yesterday, so I just wanted to prove that I did. Hold on a sec, I'm going to turn around sound people. So this is me. I was born in Borneo, lived in Indonesia, went to school in York, private boarding school, where I was told that I was good at art, and then I decided at 14 that was it. I would try and do nothing else. And so I was given an opportunity to do life drawing because I didn't have, there wasn't enough going on in the school for art. And so I got a portfolio. So the first kind of falling forward was being told I was good at art, then going to Central. The Sex Pistols piece was really most important to me because I saw the first gig rather than booking it. They were an enormous influence, and I think still the whole notion of punk and what punk music engendered drives everything I do, really. As Dave said, that turned to Vivienne Westwood. Glenn Matlock helped set up Rockin' Russian with me. I printed the T-shirts that Vivienne put out through Sex and Traditionaries for a long time, et cetera, et cetera. So Glenn for Rockin' Russian, getting into album covers, that led to Iggy Pop. When I was doing an album cover for him, he asked if I knew anyone who'd made music videos, and we said, we'll do it. Had no idea what a music video was, but it turned out to be the next sort of influence, because then I did a bunch of music videos. I think I did more than 100, which in turn took me to the States, where I met my beautiful family, or my beautiful wife, and then the family followed. David Fincher, I worked 7 days a week for a year with him, and that gave me, I think the first time I worked with him, the biggest set I'd built was 12 foot tall. And he, just the first set I did with him, I said, how tall do you want the walls? And he went, 35 feet. I had no idea how to do that kind of thing, but so he pushed all of that forward. And then into movies and meeting Steven Spielberg, which I'll talk about, MIT, which took me really into an art and technology space. Each of these things was completely unexpected. In the end, the lab sort of drove me to start experimental to pay for my teaching habit, and here we are. So this quote, I think, is really important for all of us right now. I think that what we're engaged in, and what I'm particularly interested in doing now, is kind of addressing this, which is that everything is changing. There's no precedent in history for what's happening right now, the good and the bad of it. And we collectively have enormous responsibility to take that on and sort of develop a new language for it. So as a designer, what I can do in the sense of the visual space that I occupy is start framing those conversations in the way that I used to with film. So this is a film, Man of Steel, the 21st film I think I worked on. What was the driver here, the provocation, was to be given the opportunity to design Krypton, redesign Krypton. So we started off actually the entire film looking at this comic cover. We'd been asked to redesign the Superman logo, which is an honor in itself. But the question that it provoked for me and for our team was, why does Superman have an S on his chest? They don't speak English in Krypton. And it struck us that that we had to kind of make sense of that before anything else. So we kind of, the design department has to kind of build its own backstory a lot of the time. We have to script in our own way the details that are really not in a conventional script. So we had to kind of create this logic for why Krypton exists at all, and we based it on this idea of an S. So first of all, we assumed that this was actually a symbol, a glyph for a family that had been in place for millennia, and one of a series of very ancient families who were really ruling the planet. And in a sense, were taking that these two pathways had evolved, one of a sort of closing in of these families to the point that they were not seeing the self-destruction of their planet, and on the other hand, they had stimulated a science, a biological science, that was able to create the technology that would take a small child into a different, distant galaxy. But one of the things that evolved here was an entire Kryptonian language. So we got a little bit crazy with this, drilling into the sort of form of lettering and language. We brought in an anthropologist linguist from Vancouver called Christine Schreier, and started breaking down what language would mean in Krypton. And so you can see on what side is that? The right-hand side, that there is a completely different sentence structure, that this is object-oriented, not people-oriented. That was very much part of the society. But anyway, we sort of evolved this entire language. In fact, if you have a Krypton dictionary with you when you're watching the movie, you can read everything in it. And then we moved from this glyph and its particular kind of proportions and shape to the idea that Krypton was based in a biological kind of science and a biological, organic center to its society. And so from that evolved an entire form language for the film, as in this image, which was a full-scale set. This is an illustration of it, but where we had to kind of confront the idea that conventional architectural technologies are basically used to a straight line, and we had to come up with a notion of every single thing in the world being curved, which meant that we had to kind of tap into the capabilities of 3D technology, working with Maya, I think in this case, and developing these forms which were rapid prototype printed. And so it was actually a very economic set because we used exactly the same parts over and over again and just moved them around. Let me just play this as a proof of that. And so throughout this Krypton development, we were designing all of these components. And then I went to the premiere. We'd spent about 6 months designing Krypton, I think. And it went, it played the first 8 minutes of the movie. And the rest of the movie was two grown men hitting each other. And it seemed to be time to stop working in films. And just coincidentally at that time, I had been asked to co-teach a class. And having done that semester, I was asked to teach full-time. And so the timing just seemed right. So I joined USC and was given this incredible opportunity almost as soon as I joined to start a lab. So the World Building Media Lab has remained in sort of full flow. The World Building Institute was a piece of it too. The Institute was essentially, or remains essentially, about communication, how to communicate this kind of integration or the power of design. So it struck me, and around this time, I was running a conference, or actually just about to start a conference, because I met a game developer who started telling me about the game engine. And I realized that basically nobody in film had ever heard of a game engine. There was a sort of visual effects component, of course, but in terms of production, this incredible piece of technology that would have served us for a decade just had not integrated, had not sort of slipped out of that silo in game into film. It was kind of outrageous. So the conference that we started was a way of bringing together all of the different disciplines, generally to put people in these kind of situations on a podium with no two disciplines ever at the same table, and try and slice through these silos that clearly still exist, but realizing that design was an incredibly powerful tool, because in almost every media, certainly in the media-based industries, design is a fluid component. It's always there. The language is pretty much the same throughout every different space, whether it's theater, architecture, or film, animation, game. There's almost no other craft in those industries that really can slice through. So that design conference, or design-based cross-media conference, drove a lot of what we were doing in the lab. I'll play a little bit of it. This is, so in the top left, this was very early, 2012. I discovered that actually the George Lucas chair, I put markers on it that would be seen by the system in the room, and modeled in VR. And watched with great delight that people who were in VR, who saw a model of model of a chair, as they wandered around, would move towards the chair and then hit it, and couldn't believe that there was a direct correlation between this physical object that they were able to sit down on and the digital. And so that led to the project, those crazy rigs where we were starting to play with early Oculus and using tracking markers. First of all, turned into a project Intel funded because they wanted us to see how we could challenge their chips and really create almost impossible situations for them to have to figure out in terms of computation. So first of all, we worked with this Intel-sponsored book, which is about a flying whale, 1896, Darwin's principles of evolution applied to genetics, and these massive and new characters are formed. And so we were given this idea of a flying whale. It was a fantastic premise, as much as it was fantasy, because it was a self-contained world. So you could play with it without any other correlation with landscape or place. It was flying all of the time. The first thing we did was we took it to CES, which is a big electronics show in the US. And we flew an 80-foot whale off the screen, out of the screen, and over 5,000 people to really test AR and what you could do with it, how you could break the screen plane. There were no devices in the audience, so there was a lot of smoke and mirrors, but you could see that the audience was reacting, and we had an amazing reaction to an audience who couldn't see anything, but understood that they were sitting underneath an 80-foot whale. So they're all waving their hands because they can see it on a screen, and they know that they're sharing the space. So that was the AR experiment. Then we went into VR more deeply and took a VR project to Sundance. So I'll just play a little bit of that. Here you start off approaching the whale. So you're on rails, which means in VR terms, you don't have any control of where you're going. You're driving, being driven. You can look around, but you approach the back of the whale with that. And then you arrive, and in your headset, you realize that there's this haptic connection to this green space around you. As you pick object, you're looking in VR, you're being directed in VR to pick things up. When you reach out, they're physically there. When you move them, they were making a change in the visual, in the VR environment. And so again, magical stuff going on. People completely amazed by the idea they could pull a virtual lever and make a change in the virtual world and feel it. And then you move from that ground-based physical interaction to a digital interaction where these little creatures called Huxleys bump up against you and react to you, and you can push and pull with them, and they play with you. And then they decide that they want to change bodies with you. And suddenly you are a floating Huxley, and you go 30 feet in the air, and you can look back down at yourself. So in 5 minutes, we've taken people through this kind of grounded experience to a completely magical experience where, even though your feet are on the ground, you're flying and accepting it completely. So it's a magical space to work in, even though I am very skeptical about it because you're putting a box on your head. It's a tricky balance in terms of a social machine, but this set things off. And I'll come back to the effect that's had. Now, just to sort of come back to the whole notion of storytelling. So by the time we'd gone through this VR experience, we realized that linear storytelling really didn't have a place in the development of narrative for VR. And we started looking at immersive theater like Sleep No More, for example, where you realize that you're standing on a stage, and where you stand, you have complete freedom to move around. It's the telling of Macbeth, for any of you who hasn't seen it, on 4 or 5 different floors in a building. Impossible to see all of narrative, any of the narrative simultaneously. You follow what you want to follow. So you are on a stage, and you're in the center of everything, and your point of view is creating the narrative. So we're very interested in that. It made us think about the evolution of story. So in this very potted and ignorant sort of history, we imagined that the early tribes had to make sense of the world around them, that there were these areas of complete unknown. And so the stories started developing to try and make sense of these different kind of occurrences or different interactions, wild animals, poisonous mushrooms, whatever, that would have to be knowledge passed down. And then the metaphor came into that because you needed to find a translation, so that the language issue had to go from talking about something to being able to transmit it as narrative. So the moon crossing the sky becomes a silver disc, which is a princess in a chariot, and all of these narratives, the great epic stories come from this passing down and across these narratives from many, many storytellers. So it's a really collaborative story space, and absolutely essential to our survival, I'd suggest, because the stories were passed down from generation to generation, and those narratives were ways of passing down survival techniques, if you like, the knowledge gained. And story was able to do that because it was this common language. And so this oral tradition created enormous resilience in the human tribe. And then the printing press slams down in 1440 and kind of messes it all up. Because for the last 600 years, we've been in a very different relationship to story. At the very beginning, those myths were able to be packaged. They would be able to be pushed around in an unyielding way, in a way that they were no longer fluid. Those books that describe the great myths remain in our libraries, and they don't change very much. The same goes for all of the crafts, in writing, in architecture, in the visual arts, in theater, in music. There's been this 600-year progress of essentially a proscenium relationship. So there is an audience, and then there is somebody telling them what to do, which I discount myself from that. But this notion of a proscenium with an audience on one side and the sort of teller and player on the other side completely separates the storytelling experience. It's no longer the shared experience. It's really it's this kind of very disconnected experience. And so you have the Starchitect, and you have these singular people, the kind of the TED Talks of the last centuries. And it's not moving us forward in the same way. And then I think what we were observing is things like interactive cinema, experimental cinema, jazz, for example, where going from 200-year-old composers who were setting the language of music down in a way that was relatively inflexible. Then you have jazz musicians who are improvising, who are driving each other, who are creating a new narrative every time they come together. And that kind of improvisational space seemed to be coming closer to that oral tradition. And then we're looking at all the digital technologies, whether it's social media or immersive mixed reality, et cetera, et cetera. In each of these cases, the whole notion of storytelling has changed. And so from that, in combination with some of the things we discovered in film, this notion of a new platform that was necessary to gather people to think about storytelling as collaboration again, is increasingly necessary, and partly because, once again, we have to make sense of the world around us. We are so surrounded by the unknown, as Yuval Sharon's saying, that we don't have any way of relying on the past in the same way. It doesn't discount history in any way, but it really requires us to think about the present and the near future in a different way. Does anybody know what this is? I'm sure in this erudite audience, somebody does. No? So this is a map of the chemistry of a small part of the pancreatic beta cell. Does anybody know what this is? Bristol, yeah. So if you looked at those side by side, you could imagine that both are relatively arcane, but we can recognize the one on the right. And our children can go out into this world and negotiate it perfectly. They understand what of this represents water, what represents large roads, where is the concentration of population. And any of you living in Bristol could probably identify where you live, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a parallel between the complexity of these two systems. I was asked 3 years ago, I met an incredible professor, a medical professor who works in molecular biology, and who had joined USC because he believed that science needs storytelling. Science doesn't understand storytelling. And so the conversation evolved to understand how we could tell stories in collaboration. And one of the earlier questions I asked him was, how do you describe the systems and the complexity of a cell? And he said it's equivalent to a large city. So from that point, we started moving towards how we could use metaphor to start breaking down the complexity, the arcane language, into something that could be distributed. Our thought was that if you took the metaphor of a forest, that we could go out into a forest, an ancient forest. If some of us, let's say a family is going out, and the mother is a scientist who's particularly interested in mushrooms, let's say, she can use, within that forest, within the context, she's getting very, very detailed data back from that walk. The father might be interested in the sense of it in a kind of museum way. The kids are running around catching butterflies. In each case, they are using the context of the forest very differently, but the forest remains this incredibly complex and detailed space. So that kind of idea between a forest, between the metaphor of a city, brought us to the main challenge, which was how do you create a language which is equally comprehensible to the child, to the high school student, to the undergrad, to the museum goer, to the scientist. This was the challenge, right? So Ray Stevens was clear that the inability for scientists to tell stories was actually creating absolute blockage in the moving forward of some of the science. So in his terms, molecular biology hadn't moved forward for 20 years because they were going deeper and deeper into the areas they do know, but there's these black holes that we're not developing, and he felt that and feels that collaboration is the thing that will break that, being able to talk to other scientists. Even other biologists don't understand the language of molecular biology, and it's pretty obscure, I mean, to anybody who's not a molecular biologist. So we brought together a group in my lab, a group of scientists, science students, molecular biologists, chemists, and on the other side, architects, game makers, artists, animators. And we sat across the table from one another, sort of staring blankly at each other for about 6 months, with absolutely no way of kind of talking across the divide, and then sort of drawing pictures of cities and making the buildings into proteins, and very silly stuff. And then one day somebody mentioned origami, and everybody lit up. You know, the folding of proteins completely understood, the architectural capability of folded forms completely understood, and suddenly there was this Rosetta Stone. So now we could move forward. That was probably 2.5 years ago. We evolved for the origami was too complex in its own way. We were trying to create a modular system that would allow us to create these absolutely recognizable forms from a base unit. So we moved into the tetrahedron. Tetrahedron is a wonderful object, form. First of all, it represents carbon, so the scientists were very happy about that. But from an architectural point of view, a kind of Lego modular kind of point of view, the tetrahedra is infinitely scalable. It also has multiple ways that it can fit together. It's very coherent in the sense of its architectural properties. You can join at an edge, you can join at a point, you can join at a face. And we realized that there was essentially nothing that we couldn't build with this simple form. And so the task now is we start developing ways to describe proteins in a completely different way. You remember that image of a protein on the couple of slides ago. It's very, very detailed and accurate for the biologist, not so much for the high school student. So we've started developing this. We've got about 30 of these built now. I'll show you they are capable of doing a lot of stuff. They have relatively different silhouettes. We were using World War II aircraft recognition charts, handbooks to say you've got to be able to distinguish one protein from another. You've got to kind of create empathy, actually, between, let's say, a high school student and particular proteins in order to get to this point where they become recognizable and approachable. And then this other kind of metaphor, which is sort of the tube map of the cell. This is, you know, the most simplistic possible model, but this actually represents the journey that we're in the middle of now, the blue line. It represents the number of points that have to be interacted with from the message that glucose sends from the membrane through the cell in order to create insulin. So a very important set of connections, and they are, the relationships are fixed, but you can see that those verticals represent each of the specific proteins, but the message can be passed to hundreds of different, thousands of combinations between this path. So that also seemed really interesting. It's linear, but it's also nonlinear at the same time. We had to develop a language for how you actually describe this in multiple terms, because one of the huge issues about the interior of the cell is that the scale is off the chart. So the nucleus is equivalent to the size of a mountain, where some of the smaller molecules are equivalent to the size of a mouse. So you've got to describe these massive changes in scale. There's a certain amount of interesting intersection because a lot of it is only vaguely known. As much as the science is very much laid out and documented, actually when you drill into it, we were asking the size of some of these proteins, and they said, well, somewhere between 100,000 something degrees of measure that I can't remember, and 1 million. You know, somewhere in between those two. So we've been working towards how you get relative scale. But what was interesting to me was I believe we've created a new language for storytelling, for driving storytelling. To my mind, this is the new storyboard, because you've got a lot of things going on at the same time. You've got relative scale, you've got the relationship, you've got time. And the thing that also becomes really interesting, going back to the VR conversation, is that your point of view is everything. The relationship between the components is absolutely fixed, but where you stand and what knowledge you want to gain from it changes the narrative completely. The other byproduct of this, and this has been, I think it said on the first slide, this idea of art science, we feel now that we've created a discipline which I know is a valued discipline, this notion of art science in perfect combination. But in this team that we have, there is literally no distinction. They know each other's craft so well, each other's specialties so well, that the molecular biologists are now being taught storyboarding in order to understand. And at the beginning, when we were talking to the biologists about how do proteins move, they kind of didn't know what we meant. You know, what does movement got to do with these chemical signals? It wasn't really, so this kind of push and pull has been amazing. But all of this really was to create a way of allowing people to actually interact with these creatures that we're developing. So we've been working for a while, and we've been working in VR for very specific reasons. We've been working with a lot of different technologies. So this is called Birdly. It's an interactive tool for flying over Google Earth and underwater. It's the first time it had ever been used as a camera, but one of the problems in VR is to get a smooth camera move. So that's, all right, so this is the current state. Massive different scales. The mountain and the mouse are all represented. It's an enormous world. You could spend hours in here. Every molecule of protein is behaving as it should. It's scaled. Obviously, if you were actually in a real cell, you couldn't move because all of these are directly connected to each other. So we had to make these kind of allowances for experience. But we're developing a language which is completely experiential, where you can start recognizing these pieces, and many, many different kinds of people can occupy the space. And it's kind of exhilarating. So when we put high school students in here, they love playing in the forest. And the undergrads are deeply engaged in this. And the scientists too. My co-PI is incredibly knowledgeable biologist. And there's a sense now that with this form language, this new visual language we're developing, that it could change the existing language of molecular biology. So it's a very exciting project. It could go on for a while because Ray Stevens wants to model the entire body, and we've just got one cell, so there's some work to be done. Oh, sorry. Well, the end of that is the insulin coming out, but you probably saw enough. So just to shift back to film and where all of this started for me, when I was hired by Steven Spielberg on Minority Report, the writer Scott Frank and I started on the same day. And that meant that there wasn't a script. It's an unusual situation to start a film, and only really because it was a Steven Spielberg film, we carried on in pre-production, despite not having a script. In fact, all we had was a kind of synopsis. If I remember rightly, it was a half page, maybe a single page. The writer would continue to work, and I think the script was ready in about a year. In the meantime, what we realized was that we had the opportunity and the means and the necessity, really, of creating an entire space within which these narratives could take place, or the singular narrative could take place, without knowing what the story was going to be. It's kind of part and parcel of a production designer's job, is that you never exactly know what the camera's going to face. So you're almost always thinking in volumetric terms, in three-dimensional, four-dimensional terms. But in this particular case, we were modeling a whole world without knowing that. So the beginning of this project, the facts we had were 3 precognitive beings in the police department who, as the disruptor, could predict violence and murder. And so had become this tool for a murder-free society. within this particular test space of Washington, D.C. So we imagined a massive influx of population. You can't build higher than the Capitol building in D.C., so a new city developing on the other side of the Potomac. And that kind of evolved into an entire world where logical, bit by bit, we were working out how the world would function, the difference between living at the top of the city and living at the bottom of the city, the difference of distances and scale and what effects the precogs have and how does that change society. It's a deep, deep research project. We were pushed out of the art department. Often when you're in a film, you either grab a bunch of books off your shelf or you look at the web. You know, you don't really have time to go out and do real research, let's say. In this case, Steven Spielberg was absolutely clear that he did not want this to be science fiction. He wanted it to be future reality. He wanted us to research the way the world would evolve. And so we pushed out into the world, and we had huge access because he was able to unlock the doors into MIT Media Lab, into DARPA, the military research space, into corporations, into Apple, into advertising industry. And so we were leaping around inside the world of research that was all directed towards reality. And we ended up with a 100-page Bible, as it would be called, of all of the knowledge that was being developed. And that in turn led to, that in turn became embedded in the film. Some incredible advisors on the film. Neil Gershenfeld was asked whether he could, who's a quantum physicist at MIT, was asked whether he could come up with a solution to precognition. He said he'd never been asked to do it before, but he thought he probably could. Actually, that drove the design of this. All of these components, including the milky liquid, were to do with kind of quantum physics, even though he thought it'd probably take 50 years before he can actually solve it. But that's kind of the way that these stories evolved. And so now, if you look on the web and you do a question of how did Minority Report change the future, there are millions and millions of hits. But it wasn't that we were being so clever. The important thing to know is that we were listening carefully. We were given this access. We were seeing work that was being done in places like MIT Media Lab. We were seeing little 2-inch square of plastic that could turn black or white. That was the early stage of the Kindle. But we could make, with the power of fiction, we could say, okay, what if cars are wrapped in that? Car could become invisible, or how could you completely change the way surfaces function? Targeted advertising, we saw the very, very big early stages in Media Lab as well. Remembering this was made in year 2000, autonomous vehicles hadn't really been considered. A lot of the things in the film were just us having access to kind of inceptive ideas. Just as one example, we were looking at transportation because we wanted to know how Tom Cruise got to work in the morning. So he lives at the top of the new city, goes to work in old DC in the police department. And so we evolved in that a kind of form language which came from a question of how would you combine an elevator and a taxi cab. And out of that came this form language of that particular shape of a car, because it had to be able to rotate on its axis to turn from vertical to horizontal. We used rapid prototyping throughout, so we did it to test it, we did it for final shooting. We made models that were based on the same data. The center model we would call DVIS, which is exploring the world in very early stages, but really actually exploring the capability of the tool. And then at the bottom left is PreVis, which Steven Spielberg cut that. It was the first time he'd used PreVis. He cut the very low resolution animation, and then the film, almost frame by frame, resembles that. So we were seeing how that data was distributed and indeed how we use technology. We started off at the beginning of the film with acrylic paint on board, and we ended up as the first digital art department because we were being driven by necessity to tell these stories. And what we also discovered was that when you stood back from this world, as it did a couple of years later, you could put completely different lenses on the world. So we could have investigated urban planning, targeted advertising, technology, mobility. Any number of these lenses could be applied to the world we'd built and solely applied to that. So we could have just said, okay, we're going to explore urban planning of a future city, and it would have no longer anything to do with the film because we had all of this data. We had this kind of holistic system to access. And that became really important. We also just quickly mention is that gesture system, which was a thesis project by a young man called John Underkoffler, was the science advisor on the film, became embedded in the real world from a thesis project because once it was in the film, somebody asked him, a corporation asked him if he could build it for real. And with that provocation, it's now, it just went public as a company. They make a system that looks exactly the same as that with slightly different tools. So we also saw that the imagination, fiction, could actually create real change in the world. This is kind of the basis of the language that we use to develop a world. I'll just kind of go through it very quickly. It asks questions. It's a provocation machine. It's kind of demanding answers because it wants to know what are the resources of the world, what are the economics of the world, what is governance, what is infrastructure, what is culture, and everything in between. If you don't answer all those questions, you don't have a world that really functions because, of course, all of these components are connected to one another. And they're also connected to each other at different scales. So we look at the outside of this as context. Where are we? When are we? If you're on Mars, it's a different set of conditions than if you're in 16th century Paris. And then we move in using the metaphor, really, of a city and then a district. The street corner, which is an essential piece of this, which is being able to zero in on some very contained areas that represent the larger city. So the microcosm that represents the macrocosm. And we do those kind of core samples in every world we can and that we make. And they're very high resolution, you can get a lot of answers from them. So if you imagine this is a slice through a sphere, those horizontals are the sort of the first layer of questions, and then the verticals can kind of expand infinitely because every question you ask produces answers, and those answers generate new answers. And we're scaling in bit by bit towards the human at the center, which is really the driver of all of this. And once you have human narratives in the center, you push those back into the world, and they intersect and collide with all sorts of parts of the world that they need for their story to develop. And that in turn makes the world more and more robust. So this is kind of the platform that creates narratives and the sort of infinite number of stories that you can tell. This is a project maybe to exemplify that a little bit. We've been asked by the American Society of Civil Engineers, we're about a year into this project, of a 5-year project, to develop 5 future cities, fictional cities, and look 25 and 50 years out. We'd actually never been asked to look 50 years out. It's a bold move by them. One would imagine perhaps that they were quite conservative, but they have been far more adventurous than any of the film production companies I ever worked with. And so the idea here was to imagine cities that would be test cases for really different sets of conditions that would generate new ways in which the engineers would think about their own work. And most of this was driven by climate change. The megacity is actually looking at the future of large cities and change of materials, intelligent servicing, intelligent networking, new construction methodologies, completely new transportation. How does that affect a city that exists in the world today? We're just starting that project now. The rural city imagines a kind of dust bowl conditions, or the threat of that from climate, global warming. And the idea that a series of towns could cluster and create the conditions of a city that allowed them to survive in completely different ways. The floating city is a project we've been working on for the past year. That imagined that ocean sea level rise started threatening, of course, the cities that were on the edge of the land at the ocean. And then the frozen city with ice melt, northern passage opening up for shipping, permafrost melt is creating new access to minerals. So this isn't a good future, but it's a realistic future where there's a whole new economic driver that could push a city out to the Arctic Circle. And then we're looking off-world at what happens 50 years out if the crazy Mars money that's being spent actually creates something on Mars for no good reason. So this is where we go from here. So this is fairly arbitrarily putting these cities on a timeline. This is our 50 years. And we start off thinking about research. So research as being the kind of present, grounded knowledge that we can get from going into labs. This is a tiny little sample. And then looking at speculation, which is where fiction kicks in, very powerful, but based on very informed, deep knowledge, deep research. And then disruptors. Again, these are tiny samples, but they gather together and they come back into that mandala form. They distribute according to where they fit, essentially, in terms of infrastructure and governance and economics. Am I getting a little feedback? What is that? Okay, everyone take 10 while you're doing meditation. And then these colors represent something entirely different. So the lenses, what the engineers are really asking is that they can look at each of these worlds through a specific set of lenses. So that's the common through line: climate change, autonomy, new constructions, economics, smart cities, alternative energy. They're not the only lenses, but they're sort of the primary ones. And so each of these colors represents a different lens, distributed in the same way through scale and relevance. And then you can pull them apart. And so you have these filters where you can actually extract knowledge in each of these different lenses. So again, this is sort of under the hood process. It develops into the floating city, where we had to come up with a logic from almost the near term, where you can imagine sort of clusters in the way that oil rigs are, perhaps, where people working on flotation, working on barricades, I've forgotten the word for that, to protect the land, spend more and more time out at the ocean, and then eventually they're living there and their families come out, and then they need services and they need schools, et cetera, and this kind of town evolves, and then it evolves more and more, and you've got to think about sustainability. How does it survive? What does trade look like with the land? How far off land is it? What are the major components? Is it economic? Is it research? So the world really keeps evolving and getting larger and larger. And then we move from this, which is obviously just a very 2D breakdown, using the hexagon just as a way of doing a fast visualization. And I'll show you a little bit where we are now, so 2050. And there's multiple things that we can get from this. So this is fictional, obviously. It's imagining certain information that's in the world. Ultimately, we can go down to the ground level. We could start thinking about the human lens. So we're looking at the systems lens and the human lens equally. there's a tendency when you look into the future, a lot of people just look down, deal with system and forget the human. And so it's very important to us to do this kind of lens change all of the time. So this is very, very early. This is a proof of concept. We won't go into high resolution, actually, because there's no advantage to make this photograph, and we need all of the computation. I mean, the computation demand is huge from this, so we need to minimize that. You can see these little call-outs, these indicators. They're proactive. So I'll just show you an example. As you push through, you can click on one of these, and then you stop, and it gives you information. And then the interesting thing here, we just ran this in a conference in Miami with 1,000 engineers, is that you get feedback. So in the early stages of this, feedback is going to change the way we build the world. And we've got amazing feedback. We had probably 300 out of 1,000 people that were really deep engineering problems. And then we can kind of pull back from this. So that's sort of the street corner world, allowing us a certain resolution. As we pull back, we get into what I call a district view, and that allows these kind of core samples to be extracted. So any number of these detailed models can come from this. We have, I think right now we have thousands. And then as we pull back out into systems view, we can start looking at a way of analyzing anything from population data to economic data to kind of heat maps of transportation. Very controlled, very deep knowledge. And we get that from these interviews. We do hundreds of interviews with experts, very diverse. We're looking specifically diversity. We have great access to engineers, but we want to talk to biologists. We want to talk to people who would inhabit this world. Dancers are just as valid in terms of the data that we need. Psychologists, we've been thinking a lot about the effect of living on a small island, essentially, and never leaving it, and what are the psychological effects of that. And then we're beginning to look into the future. So this is the very, very early sort of sketch stage of how might this evolve? How does technology really start pushing us to think differently? This one's really interesting to me, where ecologies develop. The city itself kind of senses the ecologies it needs. So we're at this sort of proof of concept stage with that floating city. We start the megacity now, and then those two will move in parallel, and we're going to go higher and higher resolution. And the reason for all of this, and the reason that the engineers are prompting the need, this society represents 145,000 engineers in the US. In every case, they're concerned about how the future of engineering is going to evolve. And the focus is on teaching. So if you can put a system like this in place at the disposal of professors or faculty to teach with, and we're imagining now you could dive into any part of this world, a class could dive into any part of this world, be provoked, extract the component that they're looking at, turn it into a BIM, into their own systems, and then develop ideas that are from this provocation. And at that point, they're now working 20 or 30, 40, 50 years in the future in their minds. And when they go out into industry, they're going to have an entirely new perspective. So the idea here is that for the engineers, it changes the entire landscape of engineering if this gets developed inside the schools. Totally different scale. This project we got involved in, I think, 2016. There is a village called Al Baida in Saudi where there's a Bedouin tribe, a nomadic tribe, who were forced to settle at an oasis that was promptly destroyed by their herds. And so they've fallen into deep poverty. And this was a project to try and create new sustainability and actually create a self-sustaining system, both in terms of developing architecture with the tribe themselves and permaculture. There's some really radical work going on in permaculture. So we're mapping, in this case, we were really just being asked to give a vision of the future for the tribe because there were real language issues. And and sort of be able to say, you know, the work you're doing now can end up here. I'll just let one of the sponsors of the project speak for a second.
Part of poverty is being reliant on someone. One of the foundational beliefs at Albeda is that all of the work that happens has to come from the population itself. As soon as we started asking them to build, one of the challenges that we have was most of them cannot be considered literate in our own language. We had to rely on a common language. And for us, it was the language of pictures and symbols. We started to come up with this idea of using the virtual space to solve real-world problems, able to visualize it in ways never seen before. Poverty is a social construct. It's a design flaw. It is something that we can undo. The future of the way that we interact with one another requires that kind of forethought and that kind of ability to extrapolate and to imagine.
So the permaculture part of this project is fascinating. They've been in place for 10 years with a permaculturist out of the US who's living there. And out of a very, very minimal rainfall in the year, he's created acres of fruit-bearing plants now. So this entire system is a proof that we can, you know, change things dramatically. And then we can take this knowledge and start putting it into these large cities. So the company that Dave mentioned called Experimental, this is a studio in Los Angeles. And I think as a result of some of what I was describing, we've built a studio that is first of all media and platform agnostic. So we believe that the storytelling is completely separate from the media that it is going to be developed for. That very often and almost always we don't know what the outcome is going to be when we start building a world. It develops organically, and it decides what platform and media it's going to be made in to a large extent. So we're looking at a very broad range of skills. It's actually very hard to find the people that we need because we're looking for these art scientists. We're looking for people with four sides to their brain, you know, so who can jump around in this space and understand that they're probably developing ideas and stories for media that doesn't yet exist. And my partners are a game company called Eline Media, and so we're really pushing together the basis of these conflicting industries and doing that slicing through. So I would love to answer questions. I'm just going to play one more thing, and then, do we have time? Okay, good. Thank you very much. Questions?